It happened at 2:43 in the morning inside the house where I grew up, the house that smelled like lemon polish and expensive silence. I had returned to Mount Pleasant because Claire's wedding was supposed to be a family celebration. At least, that is what everyone kept repeating at dinner. I went to bed that night wearing the gray cotton shirt I used to borrow from my dad when I was little, clutching the rehearsed speech I never got to give. I remember the moonlight cutting across the guest room, the sound of the old air conditioner, and the weight of pretending that everything was fine. Then something cold and solid crashed against my face. There was no warning, no voice, just the violent impact and the taste of iron rushing down my throat. My jaw felt like it had splintered into 1,000 sharp edges. The sound inside my head wasn't a scream, it was a ringing so high and sharp it blurred the room. I tried to breathe, but it came out as a choking gasp. When my eyes cleared, I saw her, Vivian Moreland, my stepmother, the woman who had raised her glass at every church gala and smiled like grace lived behind her teeth. She stood over me in her silk robe, holding the thick crystal vase from the dining table. The vase was smeared with something dark. Her voice was calm. "Now you won't ruin her pictures." I thought it was a dream until I saw the way her eyes did not flinch. Then he appeared. My father. The man who once tucked me in during thunderstorms stood behind her, not to stop her, but to watch. He held a glass of champagne the leftover from the rehearsal dinner. His smile wasn't kind. Finally, she'll match her worth. Then their glasses touched. Clink. That sound carved itself into my bones. I tried to sit up, but the room swayed like a sinking boat. Vivian bent down close enough for me to smell the citrus perfume she wore every Sunday. "You should know when to stay invisible." My jaw throbbed with each heartbeat. The carpet beneath me felt damp where blood pooled slowly into the fibers. My hands shook, but I forced my knees under me. I crawled to the bathroom like an animal trying to escape a trap. The mirror was waiting. When the light flicked on, the reflection wasn't mine anymore. My cheek was swelling, my lip was split, a line of blood ran from the corner of my mouth down to the collarbone. I pressed my palm to it, but the warmth only spread. I didn't cry. I should have. I used to cry over small things like harsh words or forgotten birthdays. But that night, there was only cold silence crawling up my spine. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of laughter from downstairs, the leftovers of their champagne toast. My hands gripped the edge of the sink so tightly my knuckles turned white. For a moment, I thought about screaming, about calling the police, about banging on every neighbor's door until someone saw me. But in that house, no one ever believed me. Not once. I pressed a towel against my face and listened to the silence press back. Somewhere between the pain and the ringing in my ears, something inside me hardened. It wasn't courage, not yet. It was the realization that they had crossed a line they could never take back. My stepmother and father had just written a story for me, but this time I would be the one to decide how it ended. My reflection looked like someone who had already lost everything worth protecting. That meant I had nothing left to fear. My fingers traced the bruising forming across my jaw, and I whispered to my reflection, "They won't get away with this." Clink. That sound played again inside my head like a clock striking the beginning of a countdown. I tilted my head back and stared at the ceiling. If you've ever watched someone smile while they hurt you, if you've ever tasted that kind of silence, then you know what came next. When I was 8 years old, my father started calling Vivian our miracle. She arrived in our lives 2 years after my mother died, wearing pearls at Sunday service and smiling like she had been born to belong. Everyone at church loved her. She organized bake sales, donated flowers to the altar, and quoted scripture with a voice soft enough to make the pastor lean in. People used to tell me how lucky I was to have such a graceful woman step into my life. At first, I believed them. I wanted to believe them. I remember the first time she brushed my hair before school, the gentle pull of the comb, and how she said sweetly, "Your mother would be proud if you tried harder to be polished." It sounded like love, but it was the first cut disguised as kindness. Over the years, she perfected the art of saying things that sounded delicate while carving away at me. She ironed my dresses until they looked like uniforms, told me to lower my voice when I laughed too loud, and reminded me to smile with my mouth closed so I wouldn't draw too much attention. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Control was her favorite language, and she spoke it fluently. When Claire was born, the house transformed. Vivian became the conductor of a perfect orchestra, and everyone else was expected to play their part. My father worked long hours at his firm in Charleston, but Vivian made sure every inch of the house was staged like a magazine spread. White hydrangeas on the dining table, polished silver, candles that smelled like vanilla and money. Claire grew up being the center of every photograph. Her birthdays were garden parties with matching dresses and tiered cakes, while mine were quiet dinners with polite smiles. Vivian used to place her hand on my shoulder during family photos and gently push me one step back so Claire would shine in the middle. I learned to stay in the background like a prop that made the scene look more complete. Every time I achieved something on my own, Vivian found a way to shrink it. When I got accepted into the University of South Carolina, she told people how proud she was that my father's name still opened doors. When I graduated with honors, she mentioned how pretty Claire looked in the graduation photos. When I got my first job at the local library, she smiled and said, "At least you'll have plenty of time to help with family events." I spent years confusing her control with care, telling myself it was better to be tolerated than invisible. But the truth is, she preferred me small. Claire, on the other hand, was everything Vivian wanted the world to see. Blonde curls, white dresses, soft laughter, and the way people's eyes followed her when she walked into a room. She never had to try. At 16, she got a car with a bow on top while I worked part-time to save for a used one. At 21, she got engaged at a vineyard in front of a professional photographer while my father made a speech about legacy and family. Vivian cried that day not because of love, but because she saw the image she had built coming to life. Claire was the crown jewel. I was the dull stone they hid behind her to make her shine brighter. The rules in our house were always unspoken but strict. Vivian dictated what was appropriate, what was acceptable, and what would make the family look good. No messy hair, no talking back at family dinners, no questioning her plans. She called it tradition. I called it breathing through a straw. She didn't need locks on doors or raised voices. Her power lived in the way people wanted to please her, in how my father would lower his eyes when she tilted her head, in how even the housekeeper whispered around her, like she was a queen who would exile them for breathing too loud. For years, I convinced myself that being quiet kept the peace. Every family dinner, every Sunday service, every staged Christmas card was another rehearsal in the play she wrote, and I played my part. I wore the soft colors she laid out. I kept my opinions behind my teeth. I moved like a ghost through rooms designed to make Claire look perfect. But peace built on control isn't peace. It's a cage that looks pretty from the outside. As I got older, I started seeing the cracks. I noticed how Vivian's smile stretched thinner whenever people complimented me instead of Claire. I saw how she pulled my father aside when I wore something too bold or spoke too directly. I heard her whisper, "She needs to remember her place." And he always nodded. He didn't protect me. He protected the performance. When Claire announced her engagement, Vivian's eyes glistened like a general who had just won a war. The wedding was the final act. Every detail was curated. The invitations printed on heavy cream paper, the flowers imported from a farm in Georgia, the rehearsal dinner hosted at the country club where Vivian sat on the charity board. People would see a perfect family standing at the altar. They would see Vivian smiling proudly. They would see Claire glowing. And me, I was supposed to be in the background again. Dull gray dress, tamed hair, silent smile, invisible. But something shifted in me the night before the wedding, long before the vase hit my face. Maybe it started years ago, the first time I watched her push me out of a photo, or the 100th time she reminded me I was lucky to be tolerated. I had spent my entire life letting her build a world where I was nothing but a backdrop. But as I lay in that guest room staring at the ceiling, I realized I was done being a part of her masterpiece. I wasn't sure how or when, but something inside me was already reaching for the edges of the cage. I didn't know then that by morning everything she built would begin to crack. But I felt it, like a storm waiting behind glass. And storms don't ask permission to arrive. The next morning, the house smelled like roses and burnt toast. The wedding caterers were already unloading trays into the kitchen, their voices rising in cheerful rhythm, while the house that had been silent last night now pulsed with the noise of preparation. My jaw ached like a bruise beneath my skin, a deep pounding that matched the steady tick of the hallway clock. When I opened my eyes, sunlight had already stretched across the floorboards of the guest room, pale and unforgiving. My shirt was stiff with dried blood, the side of my face tender and swollen. For a moment, I lay still listening. No panic, no whispered apology outside the door, just the laughter of a house rehearsing its role for a perfect day. I forced myself to sit up. My reflection in the small mirror above the dresser made my stomach clench. The left side of my jaw was a soft purple halo. My lip cracked in two places, and my cheek carried the faint outline of where the vase had hit. My tongue tasted like copper. My hair had dried into uneven waves from the tears and sweat I hadn't noticed shedding in the night. I thought about calling someone, but my hands didn't move. There was no one in that house who would listen, and outside it no one who would believe. Vivian had spent years sculpting the perfect image of this family, and I had been standing behind her smile like a shadow. A knock came at the door, not a gentle one, the kind that meant someone expected you to obey. When I opened it, Vivian stood there in cream silk and pearls already dressed for the day. Her face wore that perfectly arranged concern she had practiced for years. One of the house staff stood behind her, holding a tray of orange juice and pastries. The woman's eyes flickered over my face for half a second before she looked down. Vivian gasped just loudly enough for the staff member to hear. "Oh dear, what happened to you?" Her voice was smooth, like a ribbon tied into a perfect bow. Before I could answer, she turned slightly toward the staff. She must have slipped in the bathroom. She has always been clumsy. The staff nodded because that was what people did around Vivian. They nodded, they agreed. They didn't look too long. I opened my mouth to speak, but pain flashed through my jaw like a warning. Vivian's eyes narrowed, not with worry, but with a quiet reminder of power. If I contradicted her, I wouldn't just be doubted. I'd be humiliated. Again. She stepped closer, lowering her voice until it was just for me. "You are not going to ruin this day, Juliet. Not for Claire, not for me, not for anyone." Her perfume wrapped around me like a chokehold lemon and roses and something colder underneath. Claire's voice drifted down the hallway before she appeared. Her robe was white, her hair curled into soft waves that framed the smile everyone loved. She stopped when she saw me. Her mouth twitched in something that almost looked like guilt, but hardened quickly into practiced indifference. "Please don't ruin this day." That's all she said. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" Just the same line Vivian had written for her years ago. Claire walked past me without touching, without pausing, without looking back. Vivian handed me a hanger wrapped in plastic, a gray dress, simple, modest, dull. It wasn't the original dress I had brought. She must have hidden that last night while I was trying to stop the bleeding. "This is better," she said. "It won't draw attention." Her tone made it clear there wasn't a choice. When I held the fabric, it felt like holding a surrender flag. I could already imagine standing in the back of the church, looking like the bruise she didn't want anyone to name. As the house buzzed around me, people moved with the certainty of a script. Florists arranged centerpieces in the dining room. The wedding planner checked off boxes on her clipboard. The caterers set up tables outside, where the sun was already pressing down. No one asked me if I was all right. No one noticed the way I held my face when I walked. Or maybe they noticed, but pretended not to. In houses like this, silence wasn't ignorance. It was survival. I went into the bathroom again and turned on the faucet, pressing a cold towel against my face. The bruise didn't fade. It pulsed in the mirror like a brand. My hair wouldn't sit right, so I tied it back with the elastic from last night. I applied foundation from the small bag I kept in my purse, layering it until the swelling was muted into something passable. The mirror didn't show pain anymore. It showed a woman rehearsing invisibility. Vivian appeared behind me in the reflection. She didn't knock this time. Her voice was low, sharp, polished. "Smile. People will be arriving soon. You're going to behave. This is your sister's day and you won't ruin it with your dramatics." She smoothed the collar of my dress as if arranging a mannequin. My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. Downstairs, the guests began to arrive early for brunch before the ceremony. Laughter bled through the windows. The sound of champagne corks echoed faintly from the garden. Vivian's favorite kind of day. Everything beautiful. Everything. Controlled. I moved through the hallway like a shadow, trying not to cast itself. In the kitchen, one of the younger caterers handed me a glass of water. Her hands shook when she did it like she knew but didn't dare say. Her eyes lifted once quickly toward the faint discoloration along my jaw. She didn't ask. She just whispered, "It'll be okay," and disappeared back toward the silver trays. I clung to that moment not because it fixed anything, but because it reminded me I wasn't completely invisible. Someone saw. Someone cared enough to say 3 small words. When I stepped into the living room, Vivian and Claire were surrounded by guests who were already complimenting the decorations. Vivian laughed softly, the sound floating through the air like perfume. She was radiant. Claire looked ethereal in white, and the two of them glowed beneath the morning sun that streamed through the tall windows. And me, standing in the corner in my gray dress, holding my face together with concealer and silence, was exactly where she wanted me. Their eyes occasionally slid toward me like glances at an unwanted smudge. Pity dressed up as politeness. Confusion hidden behind smiles. One woman whispered something behind her hand, and another nodded eyes flicking toward the bruise that makeup couldn't fully erase. I lowered my chin, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew what they were seeing. They were seeing the version of me Vivian wanted them to believe in. Clumsy Juliet, awkward Juliet, the one who slipped in the bathroom. Vivian raised her glass of orange juice and a mock toast with a few guests. Her laugh was light, perfect, rehearsed. I watched her across the room, every gesture polished, every glance calculated. She had spent years teaching me how to disappear. But for the first time, as the sunlight hit her pearls, I didn't feel small. I felt the edges of something sharp forming beneath my quiet. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not be her backdrop forever. The bells of St. Michael's Church rang at noon, their echo floating over Charleston's cobblestone streets like a warning wrapped in lace. Sunlight fell through the live oaks lining the square, turning everything gold and soft, as if the world had decided this would be the perfect day. That was exactly what Vivian wanted, a perfect day. She had spent months curating every detail down to the scent of the flowers lining the pews, white roses, hydrangeas, and that sharp undertone of champagne that seemed to follow her everywhere. I stepped out of the car and adjusted the gray dress she had chosen for me. The fabric was light, but it hung like a weight I couldn't shake off. My jaw ached with each movement hidden under layers of concealer that didn't fully mask the swelling. The mirror in the church lobby had already told me what I needed to know. People would see it. They would pretend not to, but they would see it. Inside the church, everything glowed. The stained glass scattered colors across polished wood and expensive smiles. Guests filled the pews, dressed in pastel and pearl, whispering about the wedding that Charleston society had been buzzing over for months. Claire Morland, the golden girl of Mount Pleasant, marrying into a family with old money and new ambition. The air was thick with approval. Vivian thrived in rooms like this where her image glittered brighter than the chandelier. I walked slowly down the side aisle and took the seat assigned to me, the very last row by the column where the stained glass shadows stretched long and narrow. My father had made sure of that. He didn't want me too close to the family photos. He didn't want me near the front where people might ask questions. The dress was meant to erase me, but the bruise pulsing beneath the makeup felt like a quiet rebellion under my skin. Across the room, Vivian stood near the altar, giving orders to the coordinator with a soft smile that everyone mistook for grace. Claire appeared moments later in her wedding gown, white silk spilling over the steps like water. Her hair was woven with pearls. Her lipstick matched the roses. She was glowing, and she knew it. My father extended his arm, and Claire placed her hand on it with a practiced smile. They walked slowly down the aisle, heads turning, guests sighing as if they were watching something holy. I should have felt small. That was always the role they wrote for me. But as the organ played and people rose from their seats, my gaze fixed not on Claire, not on my father, but on Vivian. She stood there at the front like a queen accepting her coronation, and something sharp settled quietly inside my chest. She thought this was her final act, the perfect wedding, the perfect family, the perfect image. Whispers trickled toward me like soft arrows. They came from women in pastel dresses with pearls on their throats, from men who buttoned their jackets like armor. I caught fragments. Poor girl. Such a shame. Maybe she was crying. Someone said she looked tired. Someone else said clumsy. I stared straight ahead and didn't flinch. They could talk. They always did. The ceremony unfolded like a page torn from one of Vivian's magazines. Vows, rings, applause. Claire's smile beamed brighter than the chandeliers overhead. My father's shoulders squared with pride. Vivian dabbed at a tear with the kind of elegance that made people around her whisper how radiant she was. And in the back row, I sat in silence, my hands pressed against the cool wood of the pew, the pulse in my jaw matching the rhythm of their carefully constructed fairy tale. After the ceremony, everyone filed out into the courtyard, where the sun pressed warm against marble statues and trimmed hedges. A string quartet played in the background. Waiters in white shirts carried trays of champagne flutes through the crowd, and the air filled with the clinking of glass. I stayed near the edge of the gathering, where the oak branches stretched overhead like ribs of a quiet cathedral. Vivian found her stage quickly. She floated among guests. Her laughter perfectly pitched her hand on people's arms, as if she owned every conversation. Claire and her groom posed for photographs by the church steps. My father stood near the catering table, shaking hands with people who wore suits that cost more than my car. I was a ghost in the corner of their masterpiece, a necessary prop that made their perfection believable. A woman I recognized from the country club brushed past me. She was one of Vivian's closest allies, the kind who wore pearls even to the gym. She paused just long enough to look at me, her smile too sweet to be kind. "Rough night, sweetheart," she whispered, then laughed softly as she walked away. I gripped the stem of my glass tighter but didn't answer. That was exactly what they expected, for me to stay quiet, for me to let them write my story while they sipped champagne. Near the center of the courtyard, Vivian raised her glass, gathering the crowd's attention. Even the string quartet softened. My father joined her side, slipping easily into the role he had played for decades. His arm brushed against hers, their smiles synchronized like actors hitting their mark. Guests gathered in a loose circle around them, faces lifted, glasses sparkling in the sunlight. I stayed where I was, half in shadow, watching them own the stage. My father lifted his glass high. "To family," he said. The crowd echoed back softly. He paused, then, looking directly at me from across the courtyard, the corner of his mouth curving into something almost cruel, even the ones who know their place. Clink. The sound echoed as dozens of glasses met in the air. It should have broken me. That was what he wanted. But instead of shrinking, something inside me went still. Cold. Clear. The same sound that had been burned into my memory the night before, now sharpened into something else. Not pain. Not fear. A promise. I lifted my head slowly, meeting his gaze across the sea of smiling faces. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. My eyes were dry. The silence around me was no longer suffocating. It was steady. This wasn't the end of their perfect story. It was the beginning of mine. The sun burned brighter as the afternoon unfolded, spilling gold across the courtyard, while the air thickened with expensive perfume and rehearsed laughter. Guests clinked glasses like it was a symphony, every sound sharp and deliberate. Vivian moved through the crowd with the grace of someone who had rehearsed every step. She laughed when people admired the floral archway, sighed modestly when they called the event elegant, and gently tilted her head when anyone mentioned how perfect Claire looked. Every word was calculated. Every movement was a performance. And the crowd, predictable as always, adored her for it. I stayed near the stone fountain in the corner of the courtyard. Water spilled quietly down marble edges, barely heard over the chatter and music. A waiter offered me champagne. I took the glass but didn't drink. The stem was cool against my palm, grounding me, reminding me I was still here, even if they were trying to pretend I wasn't. The bruise under my makeup throbbed a soft pulse beneath the bright chatter. I pressed my tongue to the inside of my jaw and tasted the metallic echo that hadn't left since last night. Claire and her groom twirled on the grass like something out of a bridal magazine. The photographer hovered around them, capturing each carefully choreographed smile. People watched and sighed as though love was something that looked perfect in photos. Vivian positioned herself at the edge of every shot, making sure she would be remembered in the background like the architect of this day. I knew that look. It was the same one she wore when she won community awards, when people whispered how gracious she was. But no one whispered about me. They didn't even know they were supposed to. I caught snatches of conversation. "She's the stepdaughter, right, poor thing? She always looks so quiet." They said it with soft voices like pity was a kindness. I had spent years living beneath those whispers, shrinking to fit the corners of their world. But not today. Not anymore. I tilted my glass just enough to feel the chill against my fingertips and let the sound of their laughter roll over me without sinking in. My father found me eventually. He didn't approach right away. He lingered across the courtyard, speaking to a group of men in dark suits. He laughed at their jokes, one hand tucked neatly in his pocket, the other holding his champagne like a trophy. When his eyes landed on me, the corner of his mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. It was the same look he gave me at every family gathering, the one that said, "You don't belong here, but you will stay quiet." I met his gaze without flinching. Then Claire floated into the center of the courtyard, with Vivian guiding her like a prized porcelain doll. The string quartet shifted to a slower melody. Everyone turned toward them. The photographer lifted his camera. Vivian raised her glass once more, her voice ringing clear above the noise. "To Claire and to family," she declared. "To the life we've all built together." The crowd lifted their glasses in unison, faces shining under the sun. My father added loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear, even the ones who need a reminder to stay in their place. Clink. The second time that sound sliced through the air, it didn't just echo. It settled inside me like a blade. I could see every smug smile, every look of polite ignorance, every person choosing the easier story over the truth. Vivian's eyes sparkled when they met mine, not with love or warmth, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who thought she had already won. I felt something shift inside me. The silence that used to trap me became steady, cold, and precise. It wasn't rage. It wasn't tears. It was a quiet understanding that this moment would not live forever. The image they built so carefully would not stand untouched. They thought they could humiliate me into disappearing just like they always had. But this time, they had handed me the exact moment I needed to remember. A few guests turned to look at me. I didn't know if they saw the bruise beneath the makeup or if they just noticed the way I wasn't clapping along with the toast. Either way, their glances were the same blend of pity and discomfort. But unlike every other time, I didn't lower my eyes. I let them look. Let them see the woman they were trying to erase. Vivian tilted her glass toward me with a smile so polished it gleamed. My father followed her lead, a faint smirk tugging at his jaw. Claire, perfect in her lace and pearls, looked at me like I was the shadow stretching across her spotlight, and for a heartbeat, everything slowed. The sound of the fountain behind me, the music, the murmurs of the guests, they all blurred into a single ringing note that cut through the warmth like ice. I lifted my glass slightly, not to toast them, but to anchor myself. I stared straight at my father, then at Vivian. My voice didn't need to be loud. My silence was louder. Their moment of triumph hung in the air like spun sugar, fragile, beautiful, and waiting to crack. I didn't need to fight them here. Not now. But this image, this perfect performance, would be the stage they'd lose everything on. The champagne touched my lips, but I didn't drink. I let the bubbles fade into nothing. The party roared on, but the decision had already been made inside me. They wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone. Instead, they handed me the perfect stage to burn their facade down. Not with noise, with precision, with truth. I set the glass down on the stone ledge beside the fountain, the cold stem leaving a faint ring on the marble. My father turned away satisfied, but I didn't. I stayed still, watching every laugh, every smile, every careless toast. Clink! The sound rolled again through the courtyard. I memorized it carefully. It would be the last time they raised their glasses without consequence. The reception blurred around the edges like a painting I had been forced to stare at for too long. Strings hummed softly from the quartet. The clinking of champagne glasses echoed through the courtyard, and Vivian's laughter floated in perfect intervals like a bell she rang to remind everyone who owned the room. Claire twirled on the dance floor in her gown veil spilling like silk over her shoulders, smiling at a man who had no idea who she really was. I watched all of it from the edge of the crowd, calm on the outside, cold on the inside. Their perfect world was still standing, and they didn't see the cracks forming beneath their feet. It was the kind of night they had always dreamed of. But I had stopped dreaming about them a long time ago. While the first dance drew all eyes to the center of the courtyard, I slipped away from the stone fountain, moving quietly toward the church building behind the reception area. The door to the bridal suite was propped open with a bouquet. The hallway smelled like roses and champagne, the air still warm from all the bodies that had moved through it earlier. My heels barely made a sound on the polished floor as I stepped inside. The bridal suite was empty now, but it carried Claire's presence like a shadow. A half-empty bottle of perfume stood on the vanity. Her lipstick was uncapped. The wedding veil lay crumpled over a chair, strands of pearls spilling down the fabric like a secret waiting to be tripped over. A phone buzzed faintly on the vanity, its screen flashing with a new message. I didn't move toward it immediately. I simply stood in the doorway, listening to the music faintly echoing through the walls. Then I saw the name on the screen. The wedding planner. And the preview of the message. Same room later tonight. I smiled to myself not out of joy, but out of the quiet precision of understanding how fragile their masterpiece really was. Claire, the golden daughter, the picture-perfect bride, couldn't even keep her own mask on for a single day. I walked to the vanity and picked up the phone, careful not to smudge the screen. The messages weren't subtle. They never are when people think no one is watching. There were months of texts between Claire and the planner. Hotel rooms, nights at the lake house. Words too intimate for someone who had just walked down the aisle in front of a church full of people. They spoke about how she hated being paraded around like a trophy, how the wedding was just a performance, how the planner knew her better than her fiancé ever would. For a brief second, I wondered if she ever felt trapped the way I had all those years. But then I remembered the bruise blooming across my jaw and the way she looked at me that morning when she said, "Please don't ruin this day." She had made her choice. I took out my own phone and the small USB adapter I had brought with me, a habit learned from too many years of knowing that people like Vivian always had secrets. I didn't break into anything. The phone was already open. I simply transferred what was in plain sight, every text, every image, every timestamp. Everything they would swear never existed once the facade cracked. My hands didn't shake. Not once. As the files transferred, my reflection caught in the mirror on the vanity. My face was still bruised, the makeup starting to lose its grip under the heat of the day. The swelling along my jaw created shadows that the mirror couldn't soften. I stared at myself and whispered, "I won't scream. I'll end it quietly." The transfer completed with a small chime. I placed Claire's phone exactly where I found it, even aligned it with the edge of the vanity like she always did. Then I turned toward the hallway, listening. The music still floated up faintly, a love song that made strangers sigh and families smile. They had no idea what was coming. I could have stopped there, but I didn't. There were bigger secrets in this family than Claire's restless heart. Secrets that had been built like a foundation, polished like glass, protected like treasure. Secrets Vivian thought no one would ever dare touch. I made my way down the hallway to my father's private study. I knew it well. It was the room where I learned to keep quiet as a child. The room with dark wood paneling, heavy bookshelves, and the faint smell of whiskey that never really left. He had left the door locked, but not very well. He trusted appearances too much. People like him always do. Inside, the desk was clean, almost too clean. But the locked drawer wasn't. He had kept the same key ring since I was 10. It was hidden in the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket, which now hung on the coat rack in the corner. I opened the drawer without hesitation. What sat inside was enough to make my pulse steady, not race. Folders, ledgers, bank transfer receipts, all of it bearing the stamp of their little empire. The charity fund that Vivian had presented as her life's mission wasn't charity at all. It was a vault. I flipped through the files slowly, methodically, like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Donations that never reached their destinations. Transfers to accounts under shell names. And right there in the middle of it, all the photos. My photos. Vivian had used my childhood pictures, the ones taken after my mother's funeral, the ones where I looked pale and fragile, to build a story about a daughter who needed help, about a family that struggled. She collected money in my name while telling the world I was nothing. I pulled out my USB and connected it to my phone. One by one, I scanned and copied every document. Emails, statements, names, dates. She had built an empire out of a lie, and I was the brick she had stepped on to reach the top. I wasn't shaking. I was calm, cold, steady. Outside, I heard laughter. Someone popped another bottle of champagne. The music rose a little louder. Vivian was probably making another toast. She had no idea the foundation beneath her was already crumbling one quiet piece at a time. I leaned against the edge of my father's desk, my fingers brushing over the USB in my pocket. It was small and light, but it carried more power than any speech or scream ever could. The laughter from outside drifted through the open window, mixed with the faint music of the quartet and the distant hum of conversations. To anyone else, it sounded like a celebration. To me, it sounded like a countdown. I moved to the computer on his desk, a sleek black monitor sitting beneath a lamp that had been there since I was a child. I pressed the spacebar, and the screen woke with the glow of familiarity. No password. He didn't need one. He trusted that no one in this family would ever dare to touch what was his. That was his mistake. The email folders were organized with the same precision as Vivian's wardrobe: outgoing mail, donations, invoices. They weren't hiding anything because they believed their image was untouchable. I opened a folder labeled Helping Hands, Vivian's Charity. Hundreds of emails stared back at me like rows of polished lies. Messages to donors with carefully chosen words. Pleas for support for their struggling daughter, Juliet. Photos of me at 13 with hollow eyes at 15, wearing the same gray sweater because she wouldn't buy new clothes at 17, on the steps of the house looking small. She used every angle of my pain as currency. I copied them all. Every file, every message, every photo. I didn't alter anything. I didn't touch what wasn't already in plain view. I wanted the truth untouched and undeniable. My hands moved with quiet efficiency, like someone who had spent years preparing for this without even knowing it. The drawer on the right side of the desk held a smaller box, a stack of donation checks, and a notebook in Vivian's handwriting. She had always been meticulous. Dates, names, amounts, even notes on how to phrase thank you letters to make the donors feel noble. She wrote things like, play up Juliet's frailty and remind them how grateful she is. It was all there in her cursive, clean and sharp. I stared at those words for a long moment, feeling the cold spread through my chest. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. She hadn't just used me, she had rewritten me. My entire life, she turned me into a story she could sell while teaching me to stay small. I slipped the notebook back exactly where I found it and closed the drawer. My father's jacket still hung on the rack. I stared at the way it carried his shape, like he was still standing there. He had been the silent partner in all of this, the man who watched Vivian swing a vase at my face without lifting a hand. He was never a protector. He was the wall she built her lies against. I walked toward the small mirror hanging beside the window. The last of the daylight caught my reflection, cutting across my bruised jaw. The concealer had started to melt from the heat, revealing the truth underneath. My face didn't look weak anymore. It looked carved out of something harder. Something that wouldn't break again. Vivian always believed control was loud and elegant. But real power doesn't need to be loud. It moves quietly. It waits. It knows exactly when to strike. I reached into my purse and checked the files again. Claire's messages. My father's financial records. Vivian's emails. Everything sat inside that USB and on my phone. Clean, legal, untouched. I didn't steal. I didn't hack. I simply preserved what they had left in the open because they believed no one would ever challenge them. I glanced once more at my bruised face in the mirror. I whispered it softly this time, not as a threat, but as a certainty. I won't scream. I'll end it quietly. As I stepped out of the study and closed the door behind me, the sound of champagne corks echoed again through the courtyard. Vivian's voice rose above the crowd, warm and welcoming another toast. I imagined her raising her glass to everything she thought she controlled. The hallway was dim, but the distant lights of the reception spilled through the windows, pulling me back toward the crowd. I walked past the bridal suite, past the bouquets, past the smiling photos pinned to the wall. None of it felt heavy anymore. At the end of the hallway, I paused by a small table stacked with wedding favors tied neatly with white ribbons. Vivian loved details like that. She thought every gesture mattered. I reached out, picked up one of the ribbons, and tied it around my wrist. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. This was the night their image cracked. This was the night their silence stopped being bigger than mine. Outside, the music swelled. Guests were gathered under strings of lights, faces flushed with champagne and contentment. Vivian and my father stood at the center of it all, drinking in the admiration they had spent years manufacturing. They had no idea their empire was already hollow. I walked down the steps, blending back into the shadows at the edge of the reception. No one noticed me. No one ever did. And that was exactly why they were never going to see it coming. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that only existed when the party was over and everyone believed the world would remain the same tomorrow. It was 4:03 in the morning, and the scent of champagne still lingered in the hallway, like a ghost that refused to leave. Outside, the garden was littered with wilting roses and half-empty flutes left abandoned on tables. The fairy lights still glowed faintly, casting soft shadows across the lawn. It was the aftermath of perfection, and no one saw the storm that was already waiting for the sun. I sat on the floor of the guest room with my laptop on the edge of the bed and my phone in my hand. My bruised jaw throbbed with each heartbeat, a metronome that kept me steady. My fingers didn't shake. They moved with purpose. For years they had silenced me. Tonight, their silence would become evidence. The USB drive lay beside the laptop. Inside it sat the story they had written in the dark, and I was done being the silent chapter. I opened my email drafts, not tied to my name, but to an account I had created months ago, back when I first began to feel the weight of their performance pressing against my chest. Maybe a part of me had always known that their empire was built on cracks. The first email was for the donors. The subject line was short. "This is what your generosity built." I attached the financial records, the photographs of my teenage face plastered across Vivian's polished appeals, the list of accounts where the donations went. I didn't add a single word of opinion. I didn't have to. The truth was enough. The second email was for the South Carolina Financial Investigations Bureau. A direct report, a clean trail, receipts, dates, account numbers, copies of Vivian's handwritten notes. They could trace every step themselves. I didn't need revenge to be messy. I needed it to be precise. The third email was the smallest file but the sharpest blade. Claire's messages with the wedding planner. Every detail of her betrayal was wrapped in the very image she had tried to make flawless. And I sent it to the one person who deserved to see it most, her new husband's family. I didn't need to say she was a liar. I just let the truth do the work. I stared at the screen as the clock ticked toward dawn. The sky outside was just beginning to pale. The house creaked softly, as if breathing in its sleep. I set the timer on each email. 9 Huzru a.m. Exactly. They'd be drinking coffee and pretending to hold their world together when it started to crumble. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the wall. For the first time, the silence in this house didn't scare me. It listened. It shifted. It waited. I reached for my phone, opened the gallery, and pulled up the photo I had taken hours earlier. 3 figures. Vivian, my father, Claire, all with their glasses raised in the courtyard sunlight glittering against their smiles. They smiled first. I typed it beneath the image and scheduled it to post at the same time as the emails. It wasn't a scream. It was a mirror. My reflection in the dark window stared back at me, bruised but unbroken. I whispered it into the quiet room. If you've ever seen someone raise a glass over your pain, you understand. This isn't about rage. This is about ending the performance. The air at dawn felt heavier, almost metallic. It pressed against the house like a held breath. Downstairs, I could still smell the remnants of last night, the champagne, the roses, the sugar from the cake that had been cut so ceremoniously. Everything around me looked almost peaceful, but beneath it ran the quiet hum of something about to break. It wasn't noise. It was certainty. I opened my laptop again, scanning through each email one more time, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted every detail to be perfect. Vivian had built an empire on polished surfaces, but I would dismantle it with precision. The email to the donors included scanned checks, proof of diverted funds, and attachments with her own words carefully outlined in black and white. No commentary, no accusations, just receipts. People like her always feared silence more than anger because silence left no space to twist the truth. The email to the investigators was even cleaner. It read like a timeline: donation drives, transactions, amounts, transfer dates, names. A breadcrumb trail so exact they could follow it without me ever speaking a word. For years, she had believed I was powerless. What she never understood was that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits in the dark, watching, learning. Then there was Claire. The messages between her and the wedding planner were as careless as they were intimate. They were so sure no one would ever find out. The dates stretched back months, texts during engagement parties after family dinners nights she claimed to be too busy for anything else. All of it was there. And now it was in my hands, waiting to go where it would hurt most. I placed my phone flat on the floor beside me, its cool surface grounding me like a steady heartbeat. No part of me shook. There was no rush of adrenaline, no guilt twisting in my chest. Only clarity. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. For years they had painted me as the unreliable one, the fragile one, the one no one would believe. So I gave them the one thing they could never silence: their own truth. I stood up slowly and moved toward the bathroom, the place where the mirror had greeted me with bruises just hours earlier. The swelling around my jaw had deepened overnight, turning purple under the skin. My lip was still cracked. The towel from last night lay crumpled near the sink. I pressed my fingers against the cool porcelain of the counter and met my own eyes. Vivian had always taught me to smile no matter what. She had spent years polishing away every sharp edge I might have had. But the woman staring back at me wasn't polished anymore. She was stripped down to something raw and real. I wasn't the shadow in their photographs anymore. I was the storm they didn't see coming. The timer on the emails glowed in the corner of my laptop screen. 4 hours and 52 minutes. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff and knowing the fall wasn't mine this time. It belonged to them. The sky outside had begun to shift from gray to the pale blue of early morning. Charleston was still asleep, unaware of what was about to unfold. I moved through the house slowly barefoot, careful not to disturb the silence that hung like a curtain. The hallway was scattered with the afterglow of their celebration: half-melted candles, crystal glasses streaked with lipstick, a single white heel abandoned near the stairs. It looked like the set of a fairy tale after the curtain had fallen. I walked past the living room where the last of the champagne bottles lay uncorked and forgotten on the coffee table. My father's jacket was still draped across the back of the armchair. Vivian's clutch sat neatly beside it the way she always left it, like even her chaos obeyed her. The house looked exactly as she wanted the world to see it. Perfect, controlled, untouched. But I knew better. I knew what was beneath the veneer. I paused at the sliding glass doors that opened to the garden. The early light made the roses look pale and fragile, like the night had drained their color. This had always been her stage. Every dinner, every event, every family gathering, Vivian had turned this house into a theater where she wrote the script and handed me my role, the silent background. But this morning, that script wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. I opened the door and stepped outside. The air smelled damp, clean, in a way it hadn't the night before. The fairy lights still flickered faintly above the empty tables. In the distance, the sound of birds waking up replaced the music that had filled the air hours ago. My breath clouded faintly in the cool morning air. I traced the exact spot where my father had raised his glass yesterday, where his words had sliced through the courtyard like a blade. Even the ones who know their place. That was the moment the last piece of my silence fell away. I sat on the stone edge of the fountain, the same place I had stood as a ghost in the corner of their perfect party. But now I wasn't invisible. They just hadn't noticed me yet. I placed my phone beside me and checked the timer again. 4 hours and 23 minutes. Each second that passed wasn't just time. It was control returning to my hands. I thought about Vivian sleeping upstairs, certain the day would belong to her. She would wake to fresh coffee and perfect hair, ready to keep the performance going. My father would read the newspaper with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his secrets were too well hidden to ever surface. Claire would sleep in silk curled against the man who didn't know yet that her vows were hollow. And at 9 a.m., all three of them would open their eyes to a different world. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter standing at the edges of their life. I felt steady, unmoving. I tilted my head back, listening to the faint wind against the trees. The house behind me loomed like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. I smiled, not out of joy, but because the quiet was finally mine. The first light of the sun crept slowly over the rooftops, cutting across the garden in pale streaks. I could hear the faint rumble of a distant garbage truck somewhere down the street, the kind of sound most people would never notice on a morning like this. But I noticed everything. It wasn't adrenaline. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when the fear that once held you has finally burned itself out. I walked back inside the wood floors, cool under my feet. The house was still quiet, wrapped in its illusion of safety. I passed by the photos that lined the hallway. Vivian and my father shaking hands at fundraisers, Claire posing with her perfect smile. Vivian holding me with that practiced look of motherly devotion. Each frame was a lie wrapped in gold. For years, I had believed the lie even when it crushed me. But now those faces didn't have power anymore. They were just artifacts of a performance that was about to end. In the kitchen, half-empty bottles stood like silent witnesses. Vivian's favorite champagne was still in a bucket of melting ice. I poured the water out slowly, watching the last of the bubbles disappear. Last night, they had raised their glasses in triumph. In a few hours, those same glasses would sit empty, forgotten, while their world burned in the sunlight. I placed the USB drive back in my bag and checked my phone again. The timer was steady. 3 hours and 51 minutes. I scrolled through the attachments one last time. Not because I doubted the evidence, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it. Vivian's emails, my father's financial records, Claire's messages. It was all so simple, all so ordinary. People think their secrets are complicated. They're not. They just count on silence to keep them safe. The house creaked as someone shifted upstairs. It wasn't loud, just the sound of footsteps moving across a bedroom floor. Vivian's heels had a particular rhythm to them, sharp, deliberate. These weren't hers. These were slower, heavier. My father, probably waking up earlier than the others like he always did. He would pour himself a cup of coffee and pretend nothing could touch him. I leaned against the kitchen counter, listening. The stairs didn't creak again. He had gone into his study, the same room where I had copied everything. I imagined him straightening his tie, turning on his laptop, scanning the headlines like any other morning. For a few more hours, he would still believe the story belonged to him. I opened the back door again and stepped outside. The wind carried the smell of wet grass and faint champagne. It was strange how quiet power could feel when it wasn't built on fear. I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to fight. All I had to do was wait. At 9 a.m., the truth would speak for itself. The sun climbed higher, its light sliding across the walls and catching the edges of the silver frames in the hallway. By 8:30 a.m., the house began to stir like any other morning. Coffee brewed in the kitchen, water ran through the pipes upstairs. The faint sound of Claire's laugh floated from her room, soft and careless. It was the kind of morning they believed would lead to another day of applause, another day where everyone adored the image they had built. They had no idea their curtain call was 30 minutes away. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in front of me, the scheduled posts lined up like quiet soldiers waiting for their signal. 9:00 a.m. sharp. One email to the donors, one to the financial investigators, one to Claire's new family. And the photo, the one with all three of them raising their glasses. They smiled first. The caption sat beneath it, simple and clean, like a knife that didn't need to shout to cut. Vivian entered the kitchen first, wrapped in a silk robe the color of cream. Her hair was perfectly arranged, as if the night hadn't touched her at all. She smiled when she saw me, but it wasn't kindness. It was ownership, that same smile she had worn for years. The one that said, "I made you small. I can keep you that way." She poured herself coffee, adding sugar with a small silver spoon. Not once did she ask about the bruise she had caused. She never needed to. She believed the story she wrote was strong enough to erase mine. A few minutes later, my father joined her. His suit jacket was slung casually over one shoulder, his tie loosened. He kissed her on the cheek, looked at me, and then looked through me the way he always had. He started talking about plans for the day, about meeting donors, about keeping the post-wedding momentum going. He had no idea the same donors would be reading their own names in my email. Claire appeared last. Her makeup was light, her smile bright. She moved like someone who believed she was untouchable. She kissed Vivian on the cheek, laughed at something my father said, then turned to me with a faint wrinkle of her nose. She didn't have to speak. Her face said it all. I was the stain they would always try to scrub out of their picture. The clock ticked. 8:59. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Vivian lifted her cup to her lips, humming a tune she used to play at every family dinner. My father scrolled through his phone. Claire opened a box of pastries. They were still in their performance, still convinced the applause belonged to them. 9:00 a.m. The timer on my phone blinked once. The emails went out. The post went live. I watched the exact moment it happened. My father's phone vibrated first. Vivian's followed. Claire's next. One message, then two, then a flood. Their faces shifted almost in sync. First confusion, then realization. Then that first flicker of panic that always comes when people who build their lives on lies finally hear the truth knocking on the door. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I just leaned back in my chair, my bruised jaw aching in the warm morning light, and listened as their world began to fracture. If you've ever seen someone raise a glass over your pain, then you know. You wait. You let the truth speak louder than your voice ever could, and when it does, you don't have to lift a finger. They break themselves. At 10:17 a.m., the sound of Vivian's phone shattered the thin layer of silence left in the house. It wasn't the delicate ring she usually received from her board members or donors. This was frantic, sharp, and relentless. She sat at the kitchen island with her coffee untouched, her silk robe still draped over her shoulders. Her hand hovered above the phone, her face pulled tight in confusion. It rang again, and again. She answered on the third ring. Her voice, usually smooth as polished glass, cracked ever so slightly. "Hello?" A pause. Her brows furrowed. Another pause. Her hand tightened around the mug until her knuckles went white. "What do you mean they're freezing the account?" I leaned against the kitchen doorway, suitcase already packed, watching her unravel. One call became two. Two became six. Each voice on the other end seemed to pull another thread from the tapestry she had spent decades weaving. Her donor smile was gone. In its place was a raw, tightening panic. My father walked in still in his suit, holding his phone to his ear. He had the same expression, confusion shifting into disbelief. Disbelief hardening into the first flicker of fear. He didn't sit down. He paced. "This doesn't make sense. It must be a mistake. We've worked with them for years." But it wasn't a mistake. It was the moment they'd never thought would come. At 10:31, Vivian's voice rose loud enough to cut through the entire house. "No. No, I have no idea what you're talking about." Then she lowered it again, sharp and frantic. "No one else has access to those records. They've always been safe." Safe. That was the word she'd lived by. Safe, behind her smile. Safe, behind their status. Safe, behind the lies they'd built like marble walls. But nothing built on a lie stays safe forever. By 10:45, my father stopped pacing. He stared at his phone like it had turned into a live grenade. "The board is calling an emergency meeting," he muttered. "They're talking about cutting ties before it spreads." Before it spreads. I almost laughed at the way he said it, like rot hadn't already been growing underneath their perfect picture for years. Vivian covered her mouth with a trembling hand as another call came through. It wasn't donors this time. It was the press. I could see it in the way her eyes widened, the way her breath caught in her throat. The clock ticked toward 11:00 a.m., and the house that had once been too quiet now vibrated with the sound of their panic. Phones rang. Doors opened and slammed. Voices overlapped in sharp, frantic tones. They were no longer the perfect family. They were just people caught in their own lies trying to hold the pieces before they turned to dust. I zipped up my suitcase calm and steady. I didn't need to yell. Their world was unraveling without me lifting a finger. By 11:20 a.m., the inevitable arrived with a single vibration on my father's phone. He stared at the screen for a long second before unlocking it with the stiff hands of a man who already knew he wouldn't like what he was about to read. Then came the sound, a small, sharp exhale, one that didn't need translation. Vivian, still gripping her phone like it might save her, turned to him. What she demanded. His voice was low, cracked in places I had never heard before. The Financial Bureau opened a case file. He held up the phone, the official email glowing like a silent verdict between them. For a moment, the entire house stopped moving. Vivian blinked slowly, as if trying to pull reality back into the shape she wanted. "That's impossible," she whispered. "They love us. No one loves you when the truth shows up." She began pacing the kitchen in bare feet, silk robe brushing against the tile, muttering about lawyers, about misunderstandings, about reputation. But the words fell apart halfway out of her mouth. There was no elegant performance left, no smile to stretch over the cracks. Her voice trembled as she said, "We can fix this. We always fix things." But this wasn't one of their quiet cover-ups. This was public. This was official. This was unstoppable. My father dropped into a chair, shoulders slumping in a way I had never seen before. He was a man who had spent years walking through life like nothing could touch him, like the truth was just something for other people to deal with. But as he scrolled through the email again, that armor began to fall away. His breathing grew shallow. "They have the transactions," he said quietly. "Every single one of them." Vivian stopped pacing. "How?" The silence between them stretched like a crack through glass. They both knew the answer, even if they didn't want to say it. They had left everything lying in the open because they believed no one would ever dare to expose them. Not donors, not friends, not me. Outside, faint voices began to gather. Neighbors, curious, nosy, restless. A car door slammed. Someone whispered something near the gate. In neighborhoods like this, whispers travel faster than headlines. It wouldn't be long before the local paper published the first line. "Local charity under investigation for financial fraud." Vivian pressed both hands against the counter, head bowed, as if trying to hold herself together. My father just stared at nothing, the weight of it all settling on him like lead. Upstairs, the creak of the door signaled that Claire was finally awake. She had slept through the first wave, but the second was coming and it would hit her even harder. I sat in the doorway with my suitcase at my feet, my hands folded calmly in my lap. This wasn't rage. This wasn't chaos. This was consequence. And for once, I wasn't the one being broken by it. They were. By 11:45 a.m., the next wave arrived like clockwork. Claire came stumbling down the stairs in a silk robe, rubbing her eyes like the world was supposed to wait until she was ready to face it. Her phone was in her hand. It started buzzing before she even reached the bottom step. She frowned confused, then answered without looking at the caller ID. "What do you mean, canceled?" Her voice rose an octave, slicing through the house. She paused, her mouth open, eyes widening with every word she heard. No, that's not wait. Who told you that?" Vivian turned sharply, her hands still braced against the counter. "Claire, what is it?" Claire stared at her phone like it had betrayed her. "The honeymoon. It's off," his parents called. "They saw something." Her voice cracked thin and brittle, a sound I had never heard from her before. She pressed the phone against her ear again. "This isn't real. Someone is lying." But no one was lying. Not anymore. Vivian rushed toward her like a general trying to steady the line. "What did they say exactly?" "They said—" Claire's throat caught. "They said they're talking to lawyers." For a moment, the three of them stood in the kitchen frozen. The clock above the stove ticked indifferent. Outside, the murmuring of neighbors grew louder, bolder now. They were no longer pretending not to notice. I could hear someone across the street saying, "Did you read the headline?" followed by the low rumble of another voice. My father ran a hand down his face, the movement heavy and slow. Vivian shook her head over and over as if she could will the world to rewind. "We can fix this," she said again, but her voice had lost the smooth certainty it used to hold. It sounded cracked, desperate. Claire's phone vibrated again. This time she didn't answer. She saw the name on the screen and pressed it to her chest like she could smother the truth by holding it close. Her fiancé's name glowed against the glass. She didn't dare call back. "This isn't happening," she whispered. But it was. It had already happened hours ago. Through the front window I saw the first reporter's car pull up to the curb. It wasn't a large team yet, just one person with a camera slung over their shoulder. But in neighborhoods like this, that was all it took. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile. "We'll handle this," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled as he straightened his jacket like he could still command the world to obey him. Vivian moved to the window and froze at the sight of the camera. Her perfect face, the one she'd spent decades training into a mask, faltered. She stepped back slowly, her hands clenching the curtain. For the first time in my life, they looked small. All three of them. Not towering figures behind polished glass, not untouchable. Just people standing in the middle of their own collapse. And I stood on the threshold with my suitcase watching it happen like the quiet morning I had always imagined. By noon, the house no longer sounded like the home they ruled. It sounded like panic. Reporters' voices floated in from the street carried by the light breeze. Cars slowed as neighbors lingered on sidewalks with coffee cups in hand, pretending not to stare. But their eyes said everything. In towns like Mount Pleasant, public shame spreads faster than the truth itself. Vivian had spent years thriving on whispers of admiration. Now she was suffocating on whispers of scandal. Vivian's voice cut through the air raw and sharp. "Juliet!" She stormed into the hallway, silk robe clinging to her like a flag of a lost kingdom. "What did you do?" Her hair, usually immaculate, had started to fray around the edges. Her face was flushed not with the practiced glow of charity luncheons, but with fury. I stood at the base of the staircase, suitcase beside me, hands steady at my sides. I told the truth. I said simply, no flourish, no apology. Just the words they had spent a lifetime avoiding. My father was still in the living room, hunched over the coffee table. His tie loosened his hands, gripping his phone like it could stop everything if he just pressed hard enough. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't posturing. He just sat there, crushed beneath the weight of the world he had built with his silence. Claire was curled up at the kitchen counter, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her phone face down beside her. She didn't even look at me. Her perfect wedding had turned into a headline before she could board a plane. The quiet confidence she wore like a crown had cracked into pieces. Outside, more reporters gathered. A second car parked across the street. Someone called her name, Vivian Moreland, like it was bait. She flinched. She wasn't used to hearing her name without admiration wrapped around it. I lifted the handle of my suitcase. The wheels clicked softly against the floor as I moved toward the door. Vivian lunged forward, fingers curling like claws, but stopped just short of touching me. Her power had always been in the performance, and the performance was over. She didn't own this house anymore. She didn't own me. "You won't get away with this," she hissed, voice cracking. I met her eyes and spoke calmly. "I already have." The front door opened easily. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the storm that had unfolded inside. The neighbors' eyes followed me, curious whispering, but their whispers no longer had power. The reporters didn't know my name, not yet. Their cameras weren't aimed at me. They were aimed at the house, the empire of glass that was finally shattering. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the wind carried the faint sound of Vivian shouting behind me, but it didn't reach me anymore. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone walking away from a battlefield. I felt like someone walking out of a cage. 1 month later, the air in Charleston smelled different. Not like champagne and roses. Not like the polished hallways of Vivian's house where whispers were currency. It smelled like old paper and roasted coffee, the scent that filled the narrow bookstore on King Street, where I spent my days now. The windows of the shop were streaked with early autumn rain, and every time the door opened, a bell chimed softly. It wasn't the sound of a grand ballroom. It was small, human, real. My apartment sat 3 blocks from the shop tucked above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and bread. It was small, 1 bedroom, 1 creaky hallway, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in, but every inch of it belonged to me. No portraits, no staged smiles, no crystal vases. The first night I slept there, I didn't wake up with my jaw clenched. I didn't listen for footsteps in the hallway. I just breathed. The news about my family had spread the way Vivian's charity parties once did, fast, relentless, impossible to contain. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was headlines. The state investigation had expanded into a formal inquiry. Vivian's foundation accounts were frozen. My father had been suspended from his firm pending review of his financial ties. Claire's marriage collapsed before the ink on the wedding license could dry. Every morning, someone new in town seemed to know the story. I never corrected them. I didn't have to. The neighbors from Mount Pleasant had become a kind of chorus. I overheard fragments of it sometimes when I walked down King Street. "Did you hear about the Morelands? She always seemed so perfect." I never liked that smile of hers. That was the thing about people like Vivian. They built their lives on being adored, and once the curtain fell, no one lined up to defend them. My phone buzzed once that afternoon. A message from an unknown number. No words, just an image. The house on the hill stripped bare. The dining room where they toasted themselves into gods was empty. The crystal chandelier still hung overhead, but everything else was gone. A hollow shell. Across the photo in Vivian's handwriting were 4 words. "Are you happy now?" I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. Instead, when I went home that night, I printed the photo on the small black and white printer I kept near the kitchen. I pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a typewriter. Not as a trophy. Not as revenge. As a reminder of what happens when lies build walls they always crack. I made coffee in my chipped mug, the same one I'd bought at a yard sale years ago when I still lived in their shadow. The steam rose gently, wrapping around my face. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at that picture on the fridge. The house that used to hold me captive now stood hollow, and for the first time, it wasn't mine to carry anymore. The next morning, I opened the shop early. Rain tapped against the windows, and a few regular customers trickled in with damp umbrellas and tired eyes. The old man who came every Tuesday shuffled toward the counter with his usual book about naval history. He looked at me for a long second before speaking. "You look peaceful," he said. I smiled, not the practiced smile Vivian had trained into me, but something softer. Real. "I finally stopped being their background," I said. He nodded slowly, the kind of nod only people who have seen too much of life can give. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't have to. Some people just understand without needing the details. He paid for his book, tucked it under his arm, and left, letting the bell on the door sing one quiet note behind him. I walked to the corner of the shop where a small table held 2 mismatched mugs and a coffee pot. One of the mugs was mine. I lifted it and let the warmth press into my hands. There were no champagne glasses, no crystal stems, no polished tables, just ceramic chipped at the rim. Clink. The sound of my mug against the table was small but real. It didn't echo like their glasses did that night. It grounded me. The last time I'd heard that sound, it was a weapon. Now it was an anchor. The storm that had lived in my chest for years had finally gone quiet. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need their punishment. The truth had done the work I never could, and I had walked away. By the second week of October, Charleston had begun its slow shift into cooler air. The tourists still drifted through King Street, but their voices were softer, their pace slower. The world outside my little apartment felt like it belonged to someone else, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the need to keep up with it. I wasn't competing with anyone's expectations anymore. I wasn't the shadow behind Vivian's perfect portrait. I was just Juliet. The investigation had become front-page news. Vivian's photo had been plastered across the local paper, not the society section this time, but next to headlines about fraudulent donations, forged signatures, and frozen accounts. My father's name followed hers listed among those under official review. I didn't buy the paper. I didn't have to. Every morning a copy sat on the counter of the bookstore where customers whispered about the story as if it were a local legend already carved in stone. She used to host those big garden parties, one woman murmured over a biography she didn't plan to buy. She always thought she was better than everyone, another replied. They said it softly, but with a kind of satisfaction people reserve for watching someone untouchable finally fall. No one knew I was the daughter. I had become invisible again, but this time it didn't hurt. In fact, it felt like safety. Claire's face appeared in the society pages a week later, but this time it wasn't about the wedding, it was about the annulment. The article was short, no quotes, no photographs of her in white. Just a single line family of groom cites undisclosed personal matters. That was the polite way of saying everything had burned down. She had disappeared from public view after that. For a family that had built their entire identity on being admired, silence was the worst punishment of all. The bakery downstairs smelled like sugar and butter every morning, and I had developed a ritual of standing at my small kitchen window, mug in hand, watching the sunrise spill over the Cooper River. There was something steady about it. No drama, no spectacle, just light moving across water. The photo of Vivian's empty house still hung on my fridge. The ink had begun to fade at the edges from the steam of too many pots of coffee, but it stayed there because it reminded me of something essential. They had spent years teaching me that power was about control, but real power was choosing to walk away. One night, as I locked up the bookstore, a reporter came in, just as I was about to turn the sign to closed. She was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and a notepad in hand. "You work here, right?" she asked. "Yes." She hesitated, studying me. "I'm writing a piece on the Moreland case. I've been talking to neighbors, former donors. It's big." "I don't suppose you know them." For a moment, I considered lying. It would have been easy to say no, but I didn't. "I used to," I said quietly. She looked curious, but didn't push. "People are angry," she said finally. "Not just at what they did, but at how long it went unnoticed." I nodded slowly. People like them count on silence. They build their world on it, and silence eventually cracks. She scribbled something down, then thanked me and left. I locked the door behind her and stood alone in the warm, dusty air of the shop. The bell had stopped chiming. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock. For years, I'd believed that the only way to survive was to keep my head down. Now I understood that stepping out of the shadows didn't mean shouting. It meant letting the light do the work. I walked home through the quiet streets, passing the fountain at Marion Square. The sky was clear and a faint chill wrapped around my shoulders. I pulled my coat tighter, but it wasn't the kind of cold that bit. It was the kind that reminded you you're alive. When I reached my building, a letter was waiting on the doormat. No return address. I already knew who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You ruined everything," it read in Vivian's familiar handwriting. I folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer with the old keys from that house, and closed it. Not out of fear, out of finality. There were no more battles left to fight. The house had fallen. The empire had crumbled, and I was still standing. The last Sunday of October arrived with a soft golden light spilling through the bookstore windows, the kind that makes even old bricks glow. Charleston felt quieter that morning. A breeze came off the Cooper River, cool and clean, carrying none of the heaviness that used to hang over me like smoke. I opened the door to let the air in and leaned against the counter, watching the sunlight dust across the worn spines of books. A woman in her 60s, one of my regulars, came in for her usual mystery novel. She had a habit of tilting her head when she looked at me, as if she could see a story behind my eyes without needing to ask for it. That day, after handing me her card, she said softly, "You look lighter, like something finally let go." I smiled, steady and warm. "It did," I said. "I stopped letting them write my story for me." She nodded, her expression softening in a way that only comes with a lifetime of understanding. "That's the best kind of freedom." When she left, I made myself a cup of coffee in the back corner. The steam curled against the window pane, leaving faint streaks. I raised the mug to my lips, and the ceramic clicked against the counter when I set it down. Clink. The sound was small, ordinary, almost invisible, but it carried more power than all their champagne toasts combined. It was mine. That afternoon, I walked along the Cooper River. The wind tugged gently at my hair, and the water caught the sun in shards of silver. I had walked that same stretch countless times before, but it had always felt like escape. Today it didn't. It felt like arrival. The city around me had learned my family's name, dissected their scandal, judged their actions, and moved on. The story no longer belonged to them. It didn't belong to me either. It just lived in the air like a faded rumor stripped of its sharp edges. Vivian was still under investigation. My father's career had frozen in place, a monument to the man who had chosen silence. Claire's face no longer graced the society pages. The empire they built had dissolved not in fire, but in quiet exposure. And me, I had started living. My apartment walls no longer felt temporary. I had filled them with books, photographs from trips I had taken alone, and drawings from people who had never known the version of me that lived in their house. I had rebuilt myself in a place where their shadows couldn't reach. Sometimes I still glanced at the photo pinned to my refrigerator, the one of their empty house with Vivian's bitter handwriting scrawled across it. "Are you happy now?" At first, it had felt like a weapon. Now, it just looked like a relic, a piece of a story that no longer had the power to wound me. I didn't need to answer her question. Happiness wasn't about their fall. It was about my freedom. Later that evening, the sky turned a warm orange and the streets filled with people heading toward the water. Couples holding hands, families with strollers, tourists chasing the last light. I stood at the edge of the riverwalk and breathed in deeply. The air was crisp, and for once I didn't feel the weight of anyone else's expectations sitting on my chest. Behind me, the city kept moving alive and unbothered. In front of me, the river stretched wide, reflecting a sky that didn't care about the names printed in newspapers. The world was bigger than their house, bigger than their lies, bigger than the girl they tried to keep small. I lifted my coffee cup, no crystal, no gold rim. Just the chipped ceramic I'd grown to love, and let it touch the railing. Clink. The third and final echo. The first time that sound had followed me, it came from their cruelty. The second from my quiet revenge. But this third belonged only to me. I didn't smile out of triumph. I smiled because the silence no longer hurt. It felt like a beginning. The river wind wrapped around me as the sun slipped lower. I turned, walked back toward my little bookstore, and didn't look back. Not at their house, not at their name, not at the girl I used to be. I was no longer their background. I was my own story.